Now, you may know that the Rolex Daytona is one of the hottest watches around. But what you might not know is that that wasn't always the case, and at one time the Daytona was actually rather unpopular. These days, of course, the Daytona is so in demand that you'd sooner get Elvis and Hendrix to duet at your birthday party than find one in a boutique. The iconic chronograph, named after the legendary Florida racetrack and immortalised by Hollywood actor Paul Newman, is one of the hottest commodities in watch collecting. But once upon a time, not too long ago, the sales of the Daytona were agonisingly slow, and its popularity was severely lacking. So how then did it soar to the top of customer wish lists the world over? Join me as we retrace the Daytona's incredible journey to the inner circle of Rolex royalty. So Rolex was late to the chronograph game. In its first few decades of operating, it produced only a handful of chronograph models through the 1920s and 30s, by which time many of its Swiss rivals were chronograph veterans. Longines, Omega and Breitling, to name but three, made chronograph wristwatches as early as the 1910s. Rolex, in contrast, preferred to keep things simple with the solid, light-on-complications watches that we've come to know and love. And while it did release a host of chronograph models before the Daytona, they were made in small numbers compared to its other more popular tool watches. But this only goes some way to explaining customers' indifference to the Daytona when it first appeared in 1963. At this point, Rolex was renowned for its water-resistant oyster case and self-winding perpetual movement, introduced in 1926 and 1931 respectively. And once these two features were combined, the words Oyster Perpetual were printed on the dial of everything from the Datejust to the GMT Master, but not the Daytona, unfortunately for it. Alas, with its manual wind movement and non-screw-down pushers, the Daytona was neither automatic nor very water-resistant, at least at the beginning. And at the same time, the Submariner was parading around on the wrist of James Bond in the 1962 film Dr. No and flying off the shelves faster than you could stir up a nice martini. Meanwhile, on the contrary, the Daytona was, to quote Watch Time magazine, a bit of a dog. So unlike today, where buying a brand new Daytona can involve long wait lists and having to butter up your local authorised dealer with morning coffees and invitations to join you for a swan-shaped paddleboat ride on the lake followed by pastries, but in the early days of the Daytona, it was quite the opposite. There's many a tale of customers being tempted with half-price discounts and being offered Daytonas as incentives to purchase other models, and even receiving them free in the mail, having collected the tokens on special packs of Doritos. Okay, that last one isn't true, but you get the picture. By the early 1970s, things had barely improved. As the ugly duckling of the watch industry, the Daytona remained unloved and overlooked, while other chronographs turned heads wherever they went. Take Omega's Speedmaster, for example. In 1964, it fought off an early version of the Daytona, the reference 6238, plus chronographs from several other brands to become the official watch for NASA astronauts. NASA put the watches through a series of rigorous tests without any of the brand's knowledge, and the Daytona came a cropper when the movement jammed and its hands warped. Whereas the Speedmaster held firm, overcoming all manner of NASA's horological torture. Landing on the moon 5 years later on the wrist of Buzz Aldrin gave the Speedmaster unprecedented bragging rights, as well as a huge marketing advantage that Omega still milks to the max today. And let's face it, who wouldn't want to wear the first watch on the moon? Other chronographs, more popular than the Daytona, included Zenith's El Primero. Launched in 1969, this watch boasted the first self-winding chronograph movement in a wristwatch. And shortly after that, a multi-brand consortium that included Hoya impressed the industry with the Caliber 11, found in their square-cased Monaco. And then Japan's Seiko even joined the party with its Caliber 6139, the world's first mass-produced automatic chronograph. The Daytona then suddenly seemed a little, well, ordinary, and could only look on with envy. Metaphorically speaking, I mean. Watches don't have eyes. Anyway, one thing Rolex did fix 2 years after the Daytona's debut was the case. With the launch of the reference 6240 in 1965, the case was now water resistant to a respectable 50 metres and upgraded to 100 metres in later models. And the watch's classic mushroom pushers were replaced with the screw-down variety used today. This allowed the Daytona to carry the word oyster on the dial, although not perpetual, as it still didn't have an automatic movement. Otherwise, the Daytona saw very little change throughout the next 2 decades. Even the movement remained unchanged from the early 70s to the late 80s, with Rolex relying on the manual wind caliber 727 sourced from the ever-reliable Swiss movement manufacturer Valjoux. And this was during the era of the quartz crisis, when even if Rolex had wanted to upgrade the Daytona with an automatic movement, it would have struggled to find a supplier. By the late 1970s, many brands were winding down production of their mechanical movements, convinced that the future lay in more accurate battery-powered watches. Things started looking up for the Daytona in 1988. This was the year that Rolex finally fitted it with an automatic movement, realising by this point that actually mechanical watches did have a future. This time Rolex struck a deal with Swiss rival Zenith to use a modified version of their El Primero movement, whereupon they removed the date wheel, reduced the frequency of the beat and called it the caliber 4030. And it was only by sheer luck that Zenith had been able to resume production of this caliber in the early 80s, having dumped the machinery that made it during the quartz crisis. Or so everyone thought. In reality, Charles Vermeau, a Zenith watchmaker, had ignored his company's orders to scrap these machines and had instead hidden them away in the attic of the Zenith factory. So when Rolex needed a self-winding chronograph movement several years later, production of the El Primero was resumed, all thanks to Mad Lad Vermeau's heroic act of defiance. And it's been instrumental not only in ensuring Rolex kept abreast of its rivals, but also in re-establishing Zenith as a brand to be reckoned with. So with this new movement came a new look Daytona, one that now boasted a beefier, sportier design, crown guards and rings around the chronograph registers. And Rolex now had a real contender on its hands. A watch that could finally hold its own alongside iconic chronographs like the Speedmaster and the Navitimer. It could also finally carry those 2 sacred words, Oyster Perpetual, on the dial. And now, having been discontinued, the manual wind versions, the ones that back in the day were harder to shift than a glued down anvil, were suddenly very much in demand. Even more so when handsome Hollywood legend Paul Newman was photographed in the 1980s wearing the old style Daytonas. Newman owned both a black dial reference 6263 and, as any Rolex scholar will know, a reference 6239 with an exotic white dial. Now, as so often has been the case with watch trends, it was Italian collectors who were instrumental in the Daytona's reversal of fortune. Newman's appearance on the cover of an Italian style magazine wearing his white dial Daytona is thought to have sparked an interest in these models, and it gave the Daytona some much needed cool factor and that Newman realness. These exotic versions with their quirky block markers on the subdials even came to be known as Paul Newman Daytonas and sold for eye-watering sums, but more on that in a minute. The last major upgrade to the Daytona came in 2000, when Rolex, by now the owner of the Aigler factory that made its movements, was finally able to equip the watch with its new in-house chronograph, the caliber 4130. This resulted in some minor aesthetic differences, such as the small seconds and 12-hour subdials at 6 and 9 o'clock swapping places, and the subdials at 3 and 9 o'clock sitting higher up on the dial. Performance also improved, with the power reserve increasing from 52 to 72 hours, and the introduction of a stop seconds function. The Daytona was now a better all-round watch than it had ever been. Yet, up until the mid-2010s, it was easy to find pre-owned models for less than RRP, and the gradual ascent to peak Daytona can be traced back to 2016, when a reference 6263 with a tropical dial sold at auction for $2 million. This was followed by the sale in 2017 of Paul Newman's personal watch with the exotic dial, going under the hammer for almost $18 million, a world record. And then came the global pandemic, where it seems like the world went watch crazy, and the Daytona was one of a handful of watches that shot up in desirability during that time, with any model in the collection, old or new, selling for multiple times its retail price. And so it remains, with the price having stayed well above retail ever since. As for the current Daytona lineup, it's more diverse than ever and is now powered by the even more impressive Caliber 4131. Introduced in 2023, this movement saw the introduction of the Chronogy escapement, Paraflex shock absorbers, and optimized ball bearings. It even looks better than any Rolex tool watch movement has ever looked, thanks to an open-worked winding rotor and Côte de Genève stripes. Although to see this movement in all its glory, you'd have to buy one of the very few Daytona models that come with an exhibition caseback. Today, the Daytona remains by far the most sought-after sports watch. In the wristwatch rankings, our data-driven report on the watches that have dominated the market this past year, the Daytona delivered a stellar performance. Not only did it come fourth in the overall rankings, it topped the list for editorial coverage as well as nabbing the top spot in the US for recognition. Once Rolex's least wanted watch, the Daytona is now its most in demand. And with every passing year, it seems to inch further and further away from its humble tool watch origins. The reference 126500LN is now the only plain stainless steel model offered in the current lineup. All other models now come in platinum, gold or two-tone, and many of them enhanced with diamonds. Without doubt, the Daytona is now considered a top-tier Rolex model, right up there alongside the prestigious Day-Date, with prices ranging from £13,600 to £120,000. Bit of a dog? Top dog, more like. Well, there you go. That concludes our chronicle of the Rolex Daytona. And if you fancy some of that sweet Racing Panda dial Paul Newman realness, you can beat the waitlist by heading over to Watchfinder.com, where you can browse Daytonas along with all the best models from all the best luxury brands and find your next pre-owned luxury watch. Check it out, and I'll catch you next time. Goodbye.